Thank you, Arlette, and welcome tonight. It's so lovely to see you. It's so much a simpatico group of friends. When we come with LUMEN VERUM, you know that people are here, open hearts, open minds, listening. Yes, I'm going to talk to you on converts. It's not actually about conversion as such, though there will be a bit about that, but it's about people who have converted and what went on in their minds and in their hearts. That's always a fascinating story. How does it happen? There's one way to a man's heart, but there are 1,000 ways to the human soul. When I say one way to a man's heart, I mean, you know, they say it's through their stomach or something, just meant to be a bit of light humour, not saying anything too terrible there. But the thing is that there are a million ways in which God can open that crack in the wall around a person that doesn't understand what's happening. And it can happen at any time. And that's why we should be on the alert at any time for anybody who's showing a sign of that receptivity. As Scott Hahn observed in his introduction to Patrick Madrid's book, Surprised by Truth, which is about converts converting, it's an American book, the practice of recounting stories has been around for as long as Christianity itself. We have evidence of St. Paul's conversion in Acts chapter 9 and Galatians 2. And after all the mission given to us by Christ as baptized Christians is really to go to do whatever we can to the ends of the earth, whether layman, priest, nun, single or married. Pope John Paul II said in his book, which is about missions and about conversion, one that we should all read, Redemptoris Missio. He said, "In the name of the whole Church, I sense an urgent duty to repeat this cry of St. Paul. From the beginning of my pontificate, I have chosen to travel to the ends of the earth in order to show this missionary concern." Remember, Pope John Paul II wrote this in 1987, so he'd already been to many, many countries on missionary journeys. He said, "My direct contact with peoples who do not know Christ has convinced me even more of the urgency of missionary activity, a subject to which I'm devoting this present encyclical. The Second Vatican Council sought to renew the Church's life and activity in the light of the needs of the contemporary world. The Council emphasised the Church's missionary nature, basing it on a dynamic way of the Trinitarian mission itself. The missionary thrust therefore belongs to the very nature of Christian life, and it is also the inspiration behind ecumenism, that they may all be one, so that the world may believe that you have sent me." John 17:21. Above all, there is a new awareness of missionary activity being a matter for all Christians, and he said for all dioceses, all parishes, Christian institutions and associations. And we're in it with LUMEN VERUM, because those in LUMEN VERUM very much realised what this missionary thrust is about. And there were people who just wanted to hear, well, what does the Church say? Clearly, because clarity, in my view, is an act of mercy. There are so many people who are confused and wandering around in our postmodern and post-postmodern times, not knowing what's going on. Clarity, such as given by organisations such as LUMEN VERUM and the many others, through the catechists in the world, through all the missionaries working everywhere, bringing clarity to people is an act of mercy. A 2025 global report based on Pew Research figures shows that at this time there are about 2.3 billion Christians, about 30% globally, maybe between 29 30%. 50% of them are Catholic. A bit more actually, slightly more. There are 2 billion Muslims, smaller numbers for Hindus, Buddhists and other religions. Actually, the Jews are 0.01% of the world population. It's interesting. But admittedly, we can reflect on Australian figures. 43.9% Christians. Catholics are more than half of that. Muslims are 3.2%, but increasing rapidly. Those with no formal affiliation, over 30% and rising even more rapidly, one might say. It's estimated they might be nearly 50% in 2050. But I think there's a problem with talking about knowns, no religious affiliation people, because you have to question, what is that based on? What is the census based on? How are they doing the figures? And I'll question that in a little while. We can become despondent when we hear these statistics. And even though Christianity is the world religion with the most adherents, we lament of its demise in what used to be called, or what is, still for us, Western Christendom. We have to draw a distinction between our age and the 1900 years of Christianity before us. Hans Urs von Balthasar, the theologian, in a book called Science, Religion and Christianity, spoke of our era in terms of the change from cosmology to anthropology, which culminated in Christian unity being tragically replaced by the secularized world. When he speaks of the age of cosmology, he refers to the four major sources of cosmology which used to be in the world: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and paganism. Now you might say paganism, but paganism, they really believed in gods and spirits, and there was somebody there who was moving and acting in the universe. But the current secular atheist deluge in the West, where many live by a creed of practical atheism, what Pope Benedict called etsi Deus non daretur, as if God didn't exist. And he said even Christians live by this. They might go to church on Sunday and they say all their prayers and then go home and then they just live as if God doesn't exist. It's a very strange phenomenon, but in the past it was not so. So the current secular humanist, atheist and even scientistic mindset denies not only that there is a God, but basically doesn't even have the energy to deny there's a God, just simply ignores the whole issue, indifferentism, and ignores the empirical evidence. And remember this, that people by nature are spiritual seekers. That we are all made to be spiritual seekers. We say, who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? No matter the person, no matter how scientific or how atheist, they all have the search for what Viktor Frankl called the search for meaning. And in all the four religions, it's interesting, there's usually some kind of a bearer of a revelation or a prophet, the one who sees and hears heavenly things. And that's the same with people who are searching for meaning. They search in some way. Who's got a voice? Who can speak something meaningful to me? In fact, Viktor Frankl said the crisis in the post-war world was not a crisis of say, lack of money or poverty or anything. He said people had money, they had jobs, they had friends, and he got this from a survey. He said the reason he found that a lot of youth were killing themselves is they lacked meaning. They weren't being given it. How important it is to transmit some meaning. Perhaps later a child might disagree with you and might argue with you, fine, but you give something to argue about, but not to give this kind of wandering around in a twilight zone without any sense of why we are here. Isn't it one of many children ask, one of their first questions, where did I come from? Who made the world? Easy questions, but they come deep from the soul in us all. So apropos the thoughts of the future of Christendom, there I was one night in 2011 outside St Mary's Cathedral at the Beatification Mass for Pope John Paul II. I was standing there with a few friends, one was Chinese, who introduced me to one of his Chinese friends. And that friend was moved to tell me his story. He said in 2005, while watching TV, he was annoyed that there was no sport on. He was really, really annoyed. That's what he wanted. He had a week of work and now he wanted to watch sport. And there's only this big funeral of some dude, you know. Who was he? John Paul II. Who is he? And he grudgingly thought, well, if there's no sport, I'll watch the funeral. So he watched it. And now, of no particular background, coming from Beijing, he became moved by something about how many people around the world from all countries had shown signs of respect for this man. And it drew him to think, this must have been a good man. See, the question of good, what does that mean in life? He asked a Chinese friend about him. And one thing led to another, and that funeral triggered his journey to join an RCIA program in Sydney, and he was baptised a Catholic, and now very fervent Catholic. Now, that didn't happen with any of us being there talking about St. Thomas's proofs of, you know, God or any sort of philosophical issue. There are all sorts of ways God finds his way into the human spirit. So I asked him if I might be able to write up his story. But he said no. I'm glad to tell you. But he said he would never state his conversion on the census to protect his family in China. Interesting, isn't it? You wonder how many others are like that. How many other converts do not state their faith on the census? On another occasion, I was visiting a house in Bankstown. Now, believe it or not, I once worked as a truancy officer. Yes, I was one of those dreaded creatures called truancy officer. And I had to go to the houses of children to say or families to say, why aren't your children attending school? So I go to a family somewhere in Bankstown. There was a purported Muslim family, and I was talking to the mother, and she spoke to me and she said, look, and she was very nervous, very hesitant, but she saw I was wearing a cross on my, she saw I was wearing a cross at the front, you know, just as a lot of us wear. And she said, I will tell you, I will tell you why my children aren't going to school. And she became very quiet. She said, I am becoming a Christian. She said, I am going to Bible study classes. But she said, my Muslim husband must never know because they will make big trouble for us. Basically implying she might be killed. She said, please do not say anything. I will not write it down anywhere. So I can imagine she won't write it down in a school note. She won't write it down probably in the census. But anyway, she said at some point they were going to be all christened. They were going to become Christians. And how many are like that? We don't know. How many don't understand the question about religion because they might be illiterate? There might be many Muslims who say, do you belong to a religion? They just don't know because they can't read it. So you have to question the census figures about the growth of people with no religion and take in another factor, and that is that even the ABC said there are many people who are writing no religious affiliation. Are you spiritual? Yes. So they confess to being spiritual, but they don't belong to any institutional religion. So interesting. How many people is that 30% of growth of those with no religious affiliation? How many is it missing? So in the midst of all this, a bit despondent, I started to wonder about converts to Catholicism. It triggered me to kind of look for other converts, to cheer myself up. It was my way of dealing with this postmodern, despondency that a lot of us can fall into. And interestingly, I started to meet people from all walks of life, all cultures, just in my ordinary daily, weekly activities. And that prompted my desire to write a book of conversion stories from Australia, and to include a few others as well, but mainly from Australia. And I believe it's the first such collection in the country. So that's what happened. A few years ago it was published, and I was very privileged and very grateful to all the people who told me their stories. So let's launch in. I won't say her name, I'll just call her Kay, a young Sydney woman. She described her journey to Catholicism. Now, I met Kay after Mass one day in St Daceyville's, at Daceyville's St Michael's Church, which had a very extroverted, wonderful, energetic priest who would invite people into his kitchen afterwards to have a cup of tea or have something to eat. And in the middle of his cooking scrambled eggs in this presbytery kitchen, as a group of us sat there, I found myself sitting and chatting with people, and I said hello to this lady. And she told me her name. Let's call her Kay. She was born in Mumbai in India, had been living in Australia for a few years. I asked if she'd lived in the parish long. She said yes, ever since she had become a Catholic. And then I asked her the question, so what were you before? And she said, I was a Zoroastrian. And when I fell on the floor and picked myself up, I said, what's a Zoroastrian? Because I wasn't too sure. Kay said that they're known as the Parawa in India, and they belong to a very ancient religion. Zoroastrianism began in ancient Persia in the late 6th, 7th century AD, founded by the prophet and priest Zarathustra. Remember the movie, Thus Spoke Zarathustra? And he was also known as Zoroaster. He reformed the polytheistic religion with his teachings about the supreme God, who was Ahura Mazda. Now, I think you think Mazda, the car Mazda, but no, that's the god of the Zoroastrians. King Cyrus and Darius were Zoroastrian. However, after the rise of Islam in the 7th century, many Zoroastrians fled from Iran in about 1400 AD as they were persecuted by the Muslims, and they made India their home. So there's a large group of them who have been living, especially in Mumbai, there. I think millions have been living there for many years. Now, according to their holy book, which is called the Avesta, Zoroastrians believe that Mazda, the god, was filled with a Holy Spirit who was the Lord of wisdom. And in Zoroastrian tradition, there's a good spirit and a bad spirit. Good spirit, Spenta Mainu, bad spirit, Angra Mainu, who is for chaos and destruction. So there'll be an end of the world in their way of thinking, where evil will be purged from the earth and God will come to earth. Interesting. It is like the book of Genesis in that some bad angels fell away from God and the good and bad angels are perpetually in conflict. Now, you might think, some of you who've read church history, this is very like a later offshoot Manichaeism, where there's a good God and a bad God, a good spirit and a bad spirit. So it may have come actually from Zoroastrian ideas in that way. So they're taken very seriously by Zoroastrians, and Kay told me she used to pray every day to God. And she used to go to the fire temple, which is their equivalent of our church. And she would do something, lighting fires and praying to the fire, to the spirit in the fire. There was no idol. This was no just simple idol or something to be ignored. They actually worshipped the spirit in the fire. She said the prayers around the fire used the ancient language of Avesta. And so the Zoroastrians already had a very strong sense. She said, Kay, that she was a very religious person. From her early youth, she used to win prizes for saying prayers, learning them, and of her Zoroastrian faith. She said, I visited the fire temple every day. I had the sense that just saying these prayers wasn't enough. I was always curious about God. I had questions about the rituals. I wanted to know more. The years rolled by, but I could not get any answers I was seeking to the mysteries. I wondered about life after death, and even had a dream at the age of 7 of a light-filled place with a throne that made a deep impression on me. She said, as a young girl, she knew some Catholics in India, but she said they didn't seem to have that evil spirit sense that the Zoroastrians had. And she tried to ask them a lot about what they believed, but she couldn't really get a lot of the answers she was seeking. She said, for example, she asked them, if Christ was the Son of God, why didn't God help him and take him down from the cross? Why did God not perform a miracle and do this? But she said, nobody could answer my question. Now I understand better why it happened that way. Then Kay related a series of tragic experiences. She got married, they moved to Australia, a business venture went wrong, the marriage broke down. As with a lot of migrants, there are a lot of sort of psychological and social and economic pressures on them, and that can lead to a lot of trouble. She was left with enormous debts she had to pay off, and she said she just kind of tried to bear with the situation because that's what her Zoroastrian faith had taught her, do good and try to do the right thing. But she said she found herself in southern Sydney and went for a walk, living near Malabar Beach in 2002, not far from where she was living. And she walked past St Andrew's Catholic Church, which is always locked every day after Mass. Always locked, but not this day. And suddenly she walks past and she goes inside. And she said her words, I don't know how to explain this, but I felt the church was calling me. I went in, I don't know how to express this, but I truly felt something so real. I felt a presence. Someone was there, but I could not understand it. I thought it was so abnormal. So after being in the church a little while, I just ran away. But the next day, she felt drawn to come back. Again, it was open when it should have been closed. She walked in again, ran away again. And the third time she came in, and she was so overwhelmed by this presence, she began to cry. And then she asked herself, why am I crying? And then she left. And then she continued to just visit the church. She asked a Catholic lady if she could go to a Sunday Mass with her. So she went along with her at Mass. The questions started to get the better of her. And she used to ask them, why do you stand? Why do you sit? What's the meaning of this bread and wine? And they said, look, you have to kind of learn and find out. She listened to the sermons of the local parish priest, Father Pat Hurley. She said, I always like listening to his sermons about the faith. He since has been transferred to another parish. She says, I asked my friends about the faith again and again, but there were too many questions about baptism, salvation, all I could not get the answers to. At that time, I thought I'll go and try other Christians, because she had no idea there were different denominations, so she tried others. She went to the Baptists, the Salvation Army. She loved them all. I observed them, I asked them questions. It's strange for a Catholic to appreciate this, but I did not sense any great difference at that stage in my life. I even attended Derek Prince's prayer meetings in Blacktown for 2 years and listened to his talk. He spoke with fire and passion, and I thought, wow. But I still had the sense of not getting to the core of the truth as I wanted to understand it. So she said she would think about questions about God. How deep is the searching of a person? She would wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning still asking questions, pondering them. She said I would kneel and pray for hours. At some stage she became ill, but she met up with a healing priest, and it was a kind of a beginnings of a cancer, and they prayed over her and she got better. So she was blown over by that. And she said she prayed even more, and she said she prayed the rosary because she heard that was a nice prayer to pray. So there she is, not baptised, not knowing where she belonged, but she's praying the rosary. And she said, but I felt a sense of evil, and I wondered why. And she said she got the answer in prayer, that she was being cleansed of evil, and that the cleaner her heart became, the more graces she would receive. Interesting that this is part of her journey. So she would say the prayers of the rosary, sometimes even till 1, 2, 3, 4 a.m. in the morning. Imagine. She understood it's a good thing to do that. And about that time, she said, I had a dream when I was visiting friends in Sydney. I remember it. I saw an enormous light and heard someone ask me, why are you so stubborn? She heard this voice saying to her in the dream, why don't you get baptised? And in the dream I answered, but I'm a Zoroastrian. And then I sensed the voice was the voice of Jesus, and it was as if he was following me. And I saw droplets of water falling all around me. I was frightened and said in the dream, please don't baptise me. But I heard the voice beckoning me into something saying, you are one of us. So interesting, the dream had such a profound effect on her as well. She said to me, because she told me this story herself, she said, can you imagine such a dream? I said, well, everybody has graces and gifts given to them in different ways. When she woke up, she actually said, oh, thank goodness it was a dream. But then she realised it was serious, and she asked Jesus in her heart, why do you want me to be baptised? And the answer came again in prayer, because I want you to do my work. And I found myself saying something like, okay, I want to do your work. And from that time, I had the sense that Jesus was always walking with me, whether I went into a church or wherever I went, on the street, wherever I was. So she had another sense of Christ showing her what the Eucharist was. So she found herself in an RCIA class. She was living out in Western Sydney at that point. She went and found some Catholic friends, went through it all, because she had wanted to join the Salvation Army before that. She thought they were pretty cool, but she said no. She went and joined the Catholics, and she said she was baptised in Bankstown in April 2007. And she said from that time, I was on fire with love of Jesus in the Eucharist, which she now understood, God with us. I would say the rosary as often as I could. Sometimes I prayed it at night, and I would not finish till the morning. I learnt to pray while working. I learnt that November was the month of the Holy Souls, and I learnt to pray for them. Then I moved back into the eastern suburbs and enrolled for a Bible study at the Sacred Heart Church, Randwick. And then I found that very good, and here I am going to Mass at Daceyville. And Father Jerzy Shanovich, who had been a missionary priest in the Congo at one stage, he was very helpful to her with a lot of her questions. Of course, one of the hardest things for a convert is often to do is to tell the family. So she wondered how to tell her brother, but in fact, he was shocked, but then he calmed down when he saw the change it had affected in her. She says of her conversion journey, my life has changed 180 degrees. I feel I am now with the living God. I walk with him, I talk to him. I think he is rectifying me, straightening me out, putting me on the right track. Regular confession keeps me on track in the sacraments, especially the Eucharist. I ask God to let me serve my purgatory on earth. And I pray a lot for the Holy Souls. I've done a course on the Eucharist and I love it. How important it is to have these courses in Sydney, in various suburbs, on various topics. People can be drawn to them from all kinds of places. She said, it's been a long road and I'm still on the journey and I'm reading other books. She said, I'm on this wonderful journey with the living God. So how beautiful is that? And from Zoroastrian to Catholic. Now, here's a story from Buddhist to Catholic, a bit different. It's by a man who I'll call E, and you'll know that I'll call him Father E at some point, because he went from Buddhist to Catholic priest. He lived in Korea, born in Korea. He said he was aware of Catholics but didn't understand anything about them. But at this point, when I was in my, I don't know, he was about 10 years old, Catholic hospitals entered the lives of the family because the father got hit by a taxi on the road. He was bleeding, and as in that state I tried to help. Other possessions had been strewn all over the road. And basically, he said a prayer. He was first taken to a public hospital, then he was taken to a Catholic hospital, and he said a prayer. He said, "Whoever you are, God of the Catholics, if you heal me, I'll join you." And he got healed. So he came home and announced to his entire family that he was becoming a Catholic, and he said he thought a family should always be united. So I distinctly remember the day my sister walked in and said to me, "Guess what? We're going to be Catholic." Just like that. So that was not a conversion with thinking and lots of arguing and anguish on the way. It just happened. He asked, "A Catholic, what's that?" She replied, "They're Christians." He said, my jaw dropped. I was shocked as I thought of some confrontational Protestants I'd met on the street. I felt confused, devastated, disheartened. This only deepened when I realised I would have to go to Mass and Sunday school each week. Back in those days, Korean children attended school 6 days a week, and the only time you had to yourself was on Sunday. And he said we had to do lots of homework at night after school, so what was I going to do with no free day? I thought it was just terrible, like a bad dream. I would do anything to have had that day off, but as children we knew we had to do what our parents wanted, and it took us some years before we realised the full extent of that miracle cure. He remembers the day of his baptism, choosing a name. They couldn't work out which saints. They got all, tangled up in this saint and that saint. So a nun said to the father, "Listen," to the father, "you're a carpenter, you'll be Joseph. Call your wife Mary for her baptismal name," and looked at E and said, "We'll call you Emmanuel, God with us." And I don't know what name his sister got, but I'm sure it was something pretty close. Maybe Elizabeth or something. But I remember the day of my baptism, my head tilting with water being poured over me, and the sense that there were great mysteries in this which I did not as yet understand but hoped to one day. Not long after this, we made our first confession and communion. And then the family moves to Australia a few years later. He completed high school, university. His parents passed away, but he continued to do some work in the Sunday school after the Mass in Korean at Silverwater at that stage in Sydney. A nun asked him if he would continue to do work at the Sunday school, and he said, no, I don't think so, just for a little while, but not for long. And he said that nun was very clever. She bribed me with a good bowl of noodles because it was so tasty. I was in a better humour after that, and she said after that I continued doing sort of Sunday school for 8 years, and then he attended some vocation talks because he started to wonder about his life, because a friend of his decided to go into the seminary and he was then pulled there, and he went, and while travelling on Sydney's Western Line between Central and Strathfield, he got his vocation. He said it was between Central and Strathfield. He thinks about Croydon. He knew where the seminary is. Yeah, but he went, did the discernment process, and has been a priest for a few years in Sydney. I met him by sheer accident when he came to my home parish in Pagewood, And he talked to me for 2 hours about the whole journey. And that's when I got this idea of how deep and how earth-shattering the whole process of conversion is. Yes, you can say the person ends up with peace, but what a journey they have to make, you know, from one world to another. I mean, Bezos has sent his rocket to Mars tonight. I don't know if you've seen it on the news, but there's a rocket on its way to Mars. It'll take 22 hours. A convert coming into Catholicism has to do a longer journey. It's beyond Pluto. They have to really give up their entire social kind of connections. Everybody who's a friend, they change everything. They sometimes give up everything. And in the Muslim world, as we know, they sometimes do it under threat of harm or damage. Now, I've told you the stories of people who had some spiritual belief who came to Catholicism, but what about if you're an atheist? And this person, RJ, I'll tell you the story of him. He lives in Melbourne. Actually, he was the son of a very prominent atheist academic, and he converted in the early 2000s. He said, "The upbringing I underwent in New South Wales, partly in Sydney, but mainly in the village of Mulgoa, was one of complete, although predominantly quiet and civil, atheism. Both of my parents, who are now dead, spent their childhood as Presbyterians, but shed religious beliefs after attaining adulthood. His father was a very intelligent philosopher, academic for many years, and who fell under the spell of the militant atheistic guru at Sydney University called John Anderson. Now, a lot of you may not know that name, but in the 50s and 60s, he was a powerful influence to be reckoned with, and he probably was responsible for many people losing their faith. If you ever want to read a good book about those years, Professor James Franklin has written such a book, and he wrote about the fact how the students were lured away from their Christian Catholic faith by this very, very clever conservative philosophy professor. He had every argument under the sun. To my dismay, my school friend went to uni, did a year of philosophy, and by the end had been convinced there is no God. I was so distressed, you know, when I heard that, but I believe in her being a spiritual seeker, and I believe she has passed away now. But towards the end, I remember giving her a Divine Mercy holy card, and she looked at it with real affection and love. And I thought, there's something there. There's something still there. She just stared at it. And of course, Christ said anybody who looks at the picture will receive great graces. So, you know, let's hope. And I invite you all to do the same. Carry a packet of Divine Mercy cards in your pockets and be handbag missionaries, you know, just hand them out whenever the occasion arises. So this RJ grew up in a very atheist atmosphere. He said his charm was, the charm of this Anderson was impenetrable, who had this influence on so many people. He said, RJ said, the atmosphere of his childhood and adolescence was one of frequent late Victorian England than Australia or America, one of clean living and high thinking. It was a compound of introverted heathenism, dusty second-hand books, long dignified silences, the smell of dry sherry, and a perpetual fog of tobacco smoke. When I read a biography of Sir Leslie Stephen, Virginia Woolf's father, I found the mental climate of Stephen's existence so similar to my own as to be positively scary. He said at one point he just flirted with the idea of Anglicanism, but he said it was simply a flirtation. It was like going to a Lady Gaga concert and liking it. That's how he described it. And then he decided one day he would no longer attend church, and he said Catholicism was just regarded as the pits by his atheist family. It had two very negative characteristics. First, it was considered vulgar. Second, it was considered totalitarian. So as to the first feature, the Catholics whom we knew generally had Irish surnames, always procreated abundantly, often had little interest in the life of the mind, and actually voted for the Australian Labor Party. It's true. That's what they voted for. And this guy's a conservative. So this was the worst sin in my parents' eyes during the Vietnam War years, that they voted for the Labor Party. Any intelligent person would vote Liberal. See how it turns out? Both my parents, during my childhood, had invested heavily in the belief that Catholicism was philosophical treason, the deadliest foe of free thought, and a kind of Stalinism mixed with holy water. Once I got much older, I would face down this bogeyman without too much difficulty, but I would be lying if I minimised its impact on my early childhood and growing up, early years. And then comes one of those things that you couldn't call a coincidence, but a God incidence. What happened? They moved house, and they moved to Mulgoa. Now, some of you may know or may not know, there is a German order of nuns in Mulgoa called the Schoenstatt Sisters of Mary. And of all things, this atheist family moved right next door to this convent. They'd each had a few acres. And of course, father of RJ would always be a gentleman and help the sisters because they needed to chop some wood. So he'd always go up the tree and chop them and give it to them, and he would say, would you like a Christmas tree? I'll chop down a tree too. Those are the days when people could chop down trees and use them as Christmas trees. And he said to his son, well, of course, Catholics are the enemies of free thought, but we don't mean them. They're different. They're nice. And the sheer goodness in action with the Schoenstatt sisters altered the parents' prejudices. And however dimly and inadequately I had learnt that Catholic history and Catholic dogma was the greatest racket in human history, such studying, like asking, by what authority do you say that, burned into my mind like acid. If the papacy was just an imposture or an exercise in power mania, then how was doctrine to be transmitted from one generation to the next? The whole Catholic enchilada was a swindle, that's what he said. Then why should its enemies have bestirred themselves to hate it so much, and why do they still? Then Robert mentions the bad example of some early Catholics. And it sort of was moving towards a turning point of his life, because what happened was his mother suffered a massive stroke and she was not expected to live. But he came across that suffering, which shows that that stroke was not powerful enough to have killed her, but it had robbed her of all speech and nearly all movement, and that it looked like she was going to live quite a while with this suffering. And he was just really shattered, and so was his father. She had worked as a nurse. She had been the mainstay of the family in her own way. RJ said, my dad simply unravelled. All his elaborate atheist religion with its sacred texts, its martyrs, its church militant, and so on. I mean, the atheist martyrs, the atheist texts, and the ostentatious tough-mindedness and the intellectual machinery, all this turned to dust. Now convinced for decades of his stoicism and its strength, he now demonstrated the truth of Clive James' cruel remark, we like to think we are stoic, but we would prefer a vision that didn't hurt so much. He resorted, this is RJ's father, to alcohol, made a practice of threatening violence to himself and others. He wept like a child He denounced the nurses for their insufficient knowledge of Socrates and Descartes, and also for inadequate care of his wife. From time to time, he became so sick that he had to be hospitalised. And he would sometimes wander around the ward looking totally confused, and sometimes even burying his thoughts in a little Gideon Bible that was by the bedside. How good were those Gideon Bibles, you know, in the hotels and around the place. He said, reading it, "I'll try anything now." He later said to his son that he was coming up to the point where he thought, "The science to which I pinned my faith is bankrupt. Its counsels, which should have established the new millennium, led instead down directly to the suicide of Europe. I believed them once. In their name I helped to destroy the faith of millions of worshippers in the temples of 1,000 creed. And now look at me and witness the great tragedy of an atheist who has lost his faith." So David's father was a very eloquent man. And David is the name of the father. He was a very eloquent man. And he asked to go home, and he was given permission to go home. Within 24 hours, he had hung himself in his own garden. And this overwhelmed RJ. You can imagine his very ill mother, who eventually died, the father. And he said, "I cannot hope to convey the horror of this event. It dealt a mortal blow to the whole atheistic house of cards, which constituted my own outlook." He even asked himself, was Dad in hell? If not, did he have the smallest hope of heaven, despite the manner of his death? And so what happens? RJ gets so overwhelmed with grief, he himself finds himself in hospital. He is in hospital trying to recover from the stress and the shock and everything that had happened to him. And what happens while he's there? What happens out of all the things that could have happened? A priest walks by and says hello to him. And he says hello. He said he wanted to talk to anybody. He was so lonely. And it was an MSc priest. And that priest bought him a book of conversion stories. And he said, he didn't even tell me the name of the priest. We can all have our suspicions. But the traditional priest, Father X, lent me the book of conversion stories, and I read them. And I was so impressed with the story of Lepanto, the Elizabethan martyrs, their Via Crucis. I could no longer resist thinking about it. I could no longer resist entry into the Catholic Church in honour of the Pope who had done so much to make Lepanto possible, as well as his 20th century namesake, who was so vilely slandered as Hitler's Pope. I took Pius. I thought, I will take Pius as my baptismal name. So he got his instruction and he became a Catholic. And I'm telling you, there is nobody more on fire. If you talk to him, you'd be exhausted after all. He is so on fire for the Catholic faith. It's wonderful. He knows his faith. He's gifted in music. He knows how to, loves Palestrina. He loves everything to do with the Catholic Church. And he said, it's interesting. What part did prayer have in my journey? He said, precious little, because he said I had extreme difficulty in prayer, especially in mental prayer. But he said, I just kept on reading and asking about basic things about the faith and said small prayers, learnt the basic ones, you know, the Our Father, the acts of faith, hope and charity, the Memorare, the Confitio. He said that's what kept him going, not any great theology or not any great kind of tomes of spiritual life. He said, For as long as I can remember, the Catholic Church's liturgical music has moved me, and it was indispensable to me. I'd grown up with a shallow knowledge of Palestrina, but later I came to love it and love it deeply. He said, I dread the sort of campy Catholic whose entire religion is merely a sort of aesthetic mud bath. He said, I really loved Bach, and I think because of Bach, had I not become a Catholic, I would have become a Lutheran. But he said no, he was very happy to be a Catholic. He said that it won't have escaped your notice, speaking to me, that at the time I formally entered the Catholic Church was a very period in which the gutter press crusade against pedophile priests was going on, and it entered its vociferous phase. Some may wonder how this crusade affected me. My answer is it hardly affected me at all, though the scandals of 2010 to a certain extent did. First, I never deluded myself into supposing priests were free from original sin. Second, I knew that those who yelled loudest against Catholic clergymen for being perverts were the same individuals who considered perversion eminently okay in so many other ways when anti-Catholics practiced it. I also knew, unfortunately all too few of today's Catholics know, that filial obedience to authority is not at all the same thing as blind obedience to authority. So to any atheist who might still be hesitating upon the brink of converting to Catholicism, understandably shocked beyond measure by any priestly sin he might come across, he said, I would say something like this. Okay, they disgust you, but don't think of them as Catholics. Unless they repent, they will go where St. Paul promised they would go. Think rather of the saints. If you were to judge us at all, us Catholics, we have the right to ask that you judge us not by our worst, but by our best. Compare Catholic saints to even the most scrupulous individuals whom the anti-Catholic world has to offer. How many Antonio Gramscis, the communist in Italy, would there be to equal intellectually and morally one Aquinas or one Pope Pius XII? Above all, be prepared to have your power of reason exercised. Some Catholic teachings seem to most Catholics presumptuous, but properly examined they are not. If you want arrogance, do not seek Catholic doctrine. Go instead to the surrealistic figures of our age peddled by the local newsagent and the global internet. What detours I might have been spared had somebody spelt out these things to me when I was younger. And there ends the story of an atheist who went to Catholic. Now, I'll just give a few brief stories before we finish. A Protestant academic in America once told me she was fascinated by Pope John Paul II. She was alive when he was alive, because he did his second PhD thesis, a habilitation thesis, which people in Europe do. They do a second PhD to be able to teach in a university. He'd done it on Max Scheler, and she, being a Protestant, had done her thesis on Max Scheler. She thought, oh, this must be a great, must be interesting guy. She goes to the airport, crowded out, and she goes and she says, I'll go along the street where the Pope mobile's going to go, and I'll just stand in one of the side streets and just watch as he goes by. So she watches, and he goes by. And this is what she told me, first-person evidence. Pope John Paul II looked at her and smiled and waved as if she was the only person on the whole street. And by this stage she was shaking a bit, and she went home and she said, I've got to find out more about this guy. And she did. And that was what triggered her journey to Catholicism. She was married to a lapsed Catholic who couldn't understand why his wife was behaving this way, but he ended up also reconverting to the faith of his youth. Now, Imam Yusuf is a former Muslim imam turned Christian apologist, and he said he had a dream of Jesus one night when he was a young man, and he woke feeling so peaceful, but he kept up being a Muslim, and then along the way met a Christian missionary, and he basically, that started his journey to becoming a Christian. He's not a Catholic, but he's become a Christian, and he says that he uses the Quran to say that the Trinity is embedded in the Quran. I was quite surprised to hear this. If you ever want to look him up, he's got a YouTube talk, Ismail Youssef, Youssef. And he just says there's talking about the Word, God being the Word coming to earth, talking about, which mirrors our incarnation. Talks about God creating the universe through his Word, and how there was a self-sacrificial love, and then about how there's a spirit. So he's pointed it out to several Muslims. To one imam that he pointed it out, the imam actually physically picked him up and threw him out of the room. But he said he still uses it, and many Muslims that he's spoken to end up having dreams of Christ. I mean, I just take this as somebody who says it, you know, but many apparently have dreams of Christ himself inviting them to join him. A Muslim friend of mine, she's a Shiite Muslim, she said, but she became a Catholic. She said, you know, a lot of Muslims are very prayerful people. She said, the Iranians, the Shiites where I was, we used to pray hours every day to God. She said, so she went to London to study and told me her story. And she said, there I was in International House in London, and there was this very nice man, and he says, can I invite you out for a cup of coffee? And she said, I'm a Muslim, you're a Catholic, forget it. And he said, but couldn't we just have a cup of coffee? Forget it, she said, forget it. And he said, look, you tell me what you believe, and I'll tell you what I believe. And we can talk that way. So she accepted that invitation. And that went on for nearly a year. Long story short, she decided to become a Catholic. And I asked her, what was the trigger? Why? You were so prayerful and so devoted to your Shiite Islam. She said, marriage. She said, I knew it was one man, one woman. And she said, I knew Islam was wrong in that, in saying that people could have multiple wives, that a husband could have multiple wives. She said, I knew it was like the natural law and reason told her that. So, yeah, now happily married with 10 children, and never looked back. There are other people converting, celebrities. You know, Shia LaBeouf, film star. He had a Jewish mother, Christian father, he had a bar mitzvah, and he was chosen to do the role of Padre Pio in the movie Padre Pio. So what did he do? He said, well, to be a good actor, you have to go and study the places where these people lived if you can get there. So he went to a Franciscan monastery. Shia LaBeouf is now a strong Catholic. Jonathan Rumi, the actor, known as the role of Jesus in The Chosen, another conversion. Rob Schneider, another actor who converted. I think one of the quickest conversions I ever heard of was from Father Paul Stenhouse, who knew a family from Hong Kong, and he was frequently invited out to dinner with various families from various different community groups, and he said he went to dinner, sat down with his family, and the lady in question who knew him was a Catholic, her husband was not. And they're having a pleasant dinner, great conversation, nice food, and he just turned around to them and said, why don't you become a Catholic? And so he did, just like that. How easy is that? But another time he triggered a conversion was when he met the Chinese flute player, Jiang Ning, forget the surname. In any case, Jiang Ning played in Mao's Last Dancer. He was that wonderful flautist. And he came out to Australia. He'd been a child prodigy as a flautist. came out to Australia, and he used to play at weddings, very much in demand. And so there he is in Randwick Sacred Heart Church, playing the flute. There's Father Stenhouse marrying the people, and then he comes up and says to Chiang Ning, "You play so beautifully, it's a gift from God." And Chiang Ning said to me, "I didn't even know. I'd heard of God, but I thought, who's this God?" And that's what triggered it. 2 years later, he's a fervent Catholic, was baptised in the chapel at the Sacred Heart Monastery, missionaries of the Sacred Heart Monastery in Kensington, has never looked back. Now, indeed, there are many in the Christian world or in the secular world who do not see the need for missionary activity. They think it's colonialism, it's imposition of a worldview on others, highway robbery of some earlier, happier state. Others, by contrast, misunderstood Vatican II, thinking they had to go to the world and adapt to it. So some have been missionaries of secularism. But in fact, the conversions are happening all the time and people are seeking. We know the statistics. We know that in 1990, 80% of Christians lived, 1890, 80% of Christians lived in Europe and America. It's only now 60%. 100 years ago, 10% of sub-Saharan Africa was Christian. It is now nearly 62%. The Democratic Republic of the Congo has the largest Catholic population, followed by Nigeria. Interesting that Brazil has 83.5% Christians. And in Korea, where a lot of having no faith has grown, there are a significant number of Christians. They outnumber the Buddhists now. Interestingly, most of the Protestant Christians are Presbyterians. I don't know if you find them anywhere else except in Scotland. And despite the persecutions of the Chinese government, it's estimated now that there are anywhere between 60 to maybe 70 million Christians in China in underground and above ground churches, and that's estimated to rise probably to about 100 million within the next few decades. But beyond the statistics, there always remains the individual journey. Who am I? Where am I going? They will never cease. These questions, even we can't pinpoint the moment of the day when we've given witness to somebody. It might be in a smile, a word, a gesture, a simple answer. Sometimes just a throwaway remark, such as we all seek meaning as human beings. Just saying something like that can start a person thinking. In one case of a Chinese immigrant who spoke to me, it was that a Catholic invited her in for a cup of tea. Now a Catholic. In Western New South Wales, I've been told there's an uptick in people wanting to be Catholics. A priest asked the seeker, because he's a bit surprised he's having to do these preparation classes, he said to me, "Well, why do you want to be a Catholic?" And the answer he got from this young man was, he wants things to have meaning, to have sense. Things don't make sense in our world. I want things to make sense. So be ready to give an explanation for the hope with you. Be like the man who wrote eternity on every street corner years ago. You may not know, but there was a man called Arthur Stace whose name became Mr. Eternity, and he wrote in indelible chalk in yellow crayons on all these Sydney pavements for about 35 years. When I was a child, I saw these eternity written everywhere, and I asked my father, "What is that?" And he said, "Oh, some guy's writing eternity." That one word from this ex-criminal and ex-alcoholic who reformed is now the name of the main cafe in Central Country Trains, and it was the word written above the Harbour Bridge in the year 2000. Right? They wrote the word eternity. That man has been immortalised in Australia's history. So have short answers as well as longer ones. As I said, be a handbag missionary ready to hand out a little picture of the Sacred Heart or rosary. You just never know. I know such a woman in Wollongong. Every time Jehovah's Witnesses and the Salvation Army hand a thing, she hands them back her Catholic things in goodwill. It's always done in goodwill, in a friendly way. And above all, with our wonderful background in LUMEN VERUM, we've listened to so many people. I've learnt so much. Listen to Robert Haddad's wonderful podcast on all these different aspects of the church. If you ever want to find out more about it, do that. And read simple histories of the church. And always have a few biblical quotes handy, not to sound like a Baptist preacher. I'm no offence to any Baptists, they're wonderful in the way they know the scripture, but just to be able to say something like, for example, Wisdom 15, "You, our God, are kind and true, slow to anger, governing the universe with mercy." Or Psalm 34:18, "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted, those whose spirits have been crushed, he will revive." And I'll finish by just reading you one stanza of one of the greatest converts of the 20th century, G.K. Chesterton. He wrote a poem called The Convert, and this is the last stanza. He says, "The sages have 100 maps to give that trace their crawling cosmos like a tree. They rattle reason out through many a sieve that stores the sand and lets the gold go free. And all these things are less than dust to me, because my name is Lazarus and I live." Thank you.